So we've got Steve Felstead up next. So Steve is on AdAlta's Scientific Advisory Board. Steve was the Vice President and Head of Clinical Research at Pfizer. So worked at Pfizer for a number of years, and during that time period developed too many drugs to mention, and responsible. And I guess we'll get into that in the panel session. But since retirement, Steve has worked for a number of investment groups, advising them on what they invest in. Works in the Wellcome Trust Fund, advising them what they should invest in, MRC, what they should invest their research dollars in. So sees a lot of technologies at lots of different stages.
Okay. Which one's which on here? Okay, I'll go forward. Okay, my wife says that if she wasn't married to me and married to somebody else, she wouldn't need to have hearing aids. So if I start tailing off and you can't hear me, shout and or send a text to Sam, who are keeping me in order. So I'm going to cover a little bit of the same ground as Glenn, but I'm going to try and put more of a regulatory drug development spin on it. I think the first thing to say is the brochure here is going to woefully underestimate the amount of money that's going into IPF by 2025, because I think we'll know the Roche results today, but I think both of these drugs are going to be well over $1 billion by basic multiplication from the 9-month and the 6-month publications. So I think the two, despite their limitations, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail, I think we're going to see very significant growth in this area. So pirfenidone, I actually came across pirfenidone when I was at Pfizer. I was head of the development part of the respiratory function there. And I saw it probably about 2007. And I think it was Intermune who were doing the little biotech company doing the work, and saw the non-confidential stuff and said, "Are you interested?" And I said no, because I thought they needed to do another study for phase 3 to secure US approval. They had one study and a sort of half a study that didn't work. But I have to take my hat off to them, because they actually were doing 72-week outcome studies, very small company, and they're the ones who eventually made the breakthrough here. And it's a very tough drug to, when you look at it, those doses of 2.5 grams a day, that's an antibiotic dose. The risk of off-target adverse effects, as Dallas was talking about, the biologics are very specific. When you're giving 2.5 grams of a drug, there's a real issue in terms of the risk of off-target effects and undesirable effects. And of course, the nausea is such that you have to titrate up over a 3-week period. And it does have some drug-drug interactions as well. Again, we'd hope in a biologic setting, you'd have less of an issue. The other issue with pirfenidone is I don't think anybody, and certainly it's not written in the package insert, is how does this work? And if you don't really know how it works, you can't do a follow-on drug, you can't really titrate the dose around, and what do you do when you add a drug to it? What are you actually doing? You're adding one drug with a known mechanism to something that's a black box mechanism. So there's a number of reasons why I wasn't overly keen on it. I'm just trying to look at the FDA's view when they eventually got around to approving it. They had an advisory board back in 2011, I think, something like that, and the advisors actually voted, I think, 9-3 in favour from their advisory committee, but the FDA rejected, and they did have to go back and do another study. And they actually went from 72-week study to a 52-week study here. And I think almost all the studies that we've seen or shown, the patients have a false vital capacity. They have about 50% of their lung function, tends to run on average in the 70 or 80%. And we do see this change in FVC. The FDA took the American Thoracic Society value of clinical significant improvement of FVC, which was thought to be 10%, and then inverted it and said, well, if you have a 10% decline, that will be very important. So then also, not only they look at the FVC, which is the primary endpoint, they look at the percentage of people who decline by 10% or more. And I think on if I press the right button on the drug, you see it's about 17 or 20%. And then in the two studies that were positive, 32%, 35% on placebo decline within either 72 or 52 weeks. And so the other thing the FDA did, they did a lot of work on mortality, cutting the data this way and that. So they looked at respiratory causality, all causality. They looked at on-drug, off-drug follow-up. And although if I'd been to running the clinical studies, I'd have been very pleased looking at the placebo and the drug effect. Looked like a pretty clear difference to me, 40% reduction in mortality over the time period of follow-up. The agencies have been very cautious and said there's a numerical difference. But because it went in the right direction, because the FVC primary endpoint was met, because some of the other subgroup analysis, 6-minute walk tests, etc., they eventually made a totality of review and said this is approved. And the sort of size of study, because it's obviously relevant for investments in the future, all these studies are about 350 to 550 subjects. We need about 300 people on drug to get drug approval here. There are a number of safety issues, some of which we've already covered. The one I would add here is there was some drug-induced liver injury that was noted in the program, and then there has been some seen in post-marketing surveillance, but the risk-benefit is viewed by the FDA as being sufficient. I did note on the previous slide the sort of the NICE, or the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK, and what they're saying, this drug will be allowed to be used in. It's a population with their FVC of 50 to 80% predicted. And if they have a decline of more than 10%, so we see the 10% again being used within a calendar year, then they're viewed as progressors and non-responders, and they're asked to be taken off the drug, which seems to be quite a harsh setting, but fortunately, I guess they can now swap on to nintedanib. So the nintedanib program, very conventional pathway. It was very nice to see this. Proper phase 2 dose response, clear dose response data. They then took that dose and the strategy for dosing into phase 3. Two studies, pretty similar size. The mechanism of action is sort of known here, but it's like a pan-kinase inhibitor. And they had a pretty good rationale for dosing at 150 twice a day and then stepping down to 100. Again, the FDA review, very much the same process. They actually reviewed it during the same calendar year. They issued the summary basis of approval at the same time. And much of the data fairly similar to the pirfenidone data. Again, mortality differences were seen. FDA described it as not sufficiently rigorous, so generally used the caveat of numerical differences. But nonetheless, I would be pleased to see that in a clinical trial. Safety, the key issue again was liver here, and Glenn's already covered the gastrointestinal disorders. The discontinuation rates on nintedanib did exceed that of the placebo, which in the pirfenidone group they didn't. So perhaps pirfenidone is slightly better tolerated in this setting. So I guess the obvious question, at least for me as a drug developer, is what happens if you add the two together, and has anybody done an experiment? And this was published last year in the AJR-CCM, a very simple trial of adding pirfenidone to a nintedanib, 50 patients or so per group, a safety and PK trial. Primary endpoint was really GI toleration, and I think you can see that you add in even more. Since both of these drugs have classic GI adverse events, you put them together, you get an additive effect. Presumably you get nausea and diarrhea on both of these. And then the discontinuations, you see more patients are discontinuing when you add in the combination therapy. The analysis of FVC, it's only 12 weeks, small differences. So really we've got a whole lot of questions unanswered. At the moment, certainly in the UK, and I think maybe in Australia, combination therapy would not be reimbursed. So but you can imagine the questions that we should be asking pirfenidone to nintedanib to pirfenidone. Should you introduce the two together? Would it make a difference? Would it show a more profound response? We've got all those questions at the moment are simply unanswered. So sort of what's next? Glenn showed a pretty big list of stuff that's ongoing. I've sort of trimmed it down a little bit here to things that I think are definitely in phase 2. And whereas phase 3 for nintedanib and pirfenidone, they look about the same once they've got the same number of subjects in positive clinical trials, about 300 to 500 on drug, for 52 weeks, the right safety database. Phase 2 is very idiosyncratic in this space. And just sort of focusing on the ones here where phase 2 has been conducted. There's been some publication, some of it in pretty decent journals. The Galapagos program, despite only 23 patients for 12 weeks, and I think only 13 subjects on drug and 4 on placebo actually made it to the endpoint, was published in the Lancet Respiratory. And quite extraordinarily, they are going into phase 3 on the back of that study. Now, I was fairly convinced that I must have missed something, but I'm reliably told nobody else could find anything with Galapagos on this particular program. They have, this is now announced, it's on clinicaltrials.gov, 1,500 patients in total, 750 patient studies. They're having to do a dose response, so they're having to take 2 doses into phase 3 because they didn't do any dose response in phase 2, so they're carrying a lot of risk. They are allowing nintedanib and pirfenidone as background therapy, one or the other, or indeed patients who are not on neither and who have never received the drug. So that started at the end of 2018. So the FDA is clearly being pretty flexible. So they're running these studies in the US, or some of them in the US. And I'm surprised, I have to say, I might have predicted the pirfenidone outcome of needing another study. I would not have predicted the FDA to actually allow them to move forward on this. But they have. Then there's 2 other programs from Fibrogen and Promedial, both announced that they will start recruiting this year. They've conducted phase 2 studies that are more substantive in numbers. And certainly if this PRN 151, I noticed that this phase 2, this was significant, P less than 0.014, this change, so although it looks relatively small, it was significant. It was on top of about 70 or 70% of these folk were actually on background pirfenidone and nintedanib. And so I think that gives me encouragement that having got these drugs approved, it is possible to add a new therapy on top and still show a significant difference in the conventional primary endpoint. And then the monoclonal antibody here, they did 103 patients. They also did a safety extension to that study of around 57 subjects, looking at on top of pirfenidone and nintedanib in preparation for their phase 3. We don't have as much detail on this program as compared with Galapagos, which is now on clinicaltrials.gov. But I think there's clearly some evidence accruing that the FDA will accept a relatively small phase 2 if you're prepared to take the risk in phase 3. That a relatively modest number of patients for 24 weeks, even on top of background, is able to distinguish between drug and placebo. And that if you put all this together, plus all the phase 1 work, there's an enormous amount of upswell of interest in IPF. And I think these are telling us that clinical studies with AD214 should still be very doable, even in the presence of pirfenidone and nintedanib on the market. So I'll just move on to some conclusions. So we've got a landmark decade for treatments for IPF. Already said this, don't know much about combination therapy. It's not an optimal therapy. I don't think either of these drugs I would describe as well tolerated. And I think that we'll probably see another drug approved within the next few years before the 10th anniversary of that approval, just on statistics. If we've got 3 drugs in phase 3 at the moment, then probability of success, probably 50% or so, one of those should get through. Clearly, we've got an opportunity to consider very carefully our phase 2 program. It's pretty diverse. I wouldn't like to rely on ever doing anything as small as the Galapagos program, because I think it puts an enormous amount of risk into phase 3, and I wonder whether the FDA will allow us to do that again. And we're seeing IV, subcut and oral dosing all in play here. So 8214 obviously would be IV or potentially subcut, depending on the dosing and the half-life. So I think most of these are self-evident now. So the approval, we've got a huge amount of confidence in development of drug. I worked on sildenafil as it transitioned from Viagra to Revatio for pulmonary hypertension, and exactly the same things happened as you had drugs actually approved specifically for the indication in pulmonary hypertension, in that case for bosantan and sildenafil. We started seeing more research activity, more patients being more carefully diagnosed, more specialisation. We've got quite a varied phase 2 pathway. My personal preference, I would do dose response over 24 weeks on stratified placebo or active background therapy. The upside has already been mentioned about fibrosis. If we can show something works in fibrosis, there's a big opportunity in phase 3B and 4, particularly if you have a well-tolerated, easy-to-use therapy. What we're seeing with increased treatment options, more patients being diagnosed, there's probably a survival advantage, so the prevalence is going up. So we're probably, just as the same happened in pulmonary hypertension, we're going to have more patients seeking therapy. And my final conclusion is I think there's, as a drug developer, significant opportunity for multiple classes here, and with clinical value and commercial success for the patient population.
Thank you. So does anyone have any questions for Steve about the IPF landscape? Lawrence?
Just one question. Could you go back 2 slides to the competition?
Yeah, that one.
Sorry. That one? Which one? That one.
That one.
Yeah.
Of the phase 2 results there, which is the one that a clinician would be excited about?
Where's Glenn?
Well, that's
Oh, is he left?
where the question was. He's not here, so I'll ask
Okay. For me, this is the most exciting one because I think it most clearly reflects the likely utility of the next wave of drugs. That it's not only on placebo, it's on top of standard of care. And I think that there will be a reluctance among clinical folk, I think, at least from our feedback, to dose for more than 12 weeks without having tried pirfenidone or nintedanib.
Right.
And because of that, I'm always looking for, not too big a study. It's only 24 weeks, remember, so the separation improves over time. So this is statistically significant. It's been a sort of relatively well-designed study. So I like that. This is quite good because it's I can't do the maths on this one, but it's probably a little bigger. It's a decent sized study, but there was no background therapy. So I'm just a little bit nervous about being able to run a 52-week study, a significant study, well, that was 48 weeks dosing, in the absence of people having nintedanib or pirfenidone introduced. So patients would probably have to roll onto standard of care.
And that's what you're seeing with the later trials, I guess, is the 40 patients, background, all of them have background.
Yeah, I mean, they would have done this. They added in another 50-odd patients and just said, is it safe on top of standard of care? Because they know they're going to have to go into, they're going to have quite an issue without having standard of care as the backbone.
So one question at the back with Jocelyn.
Okay. So having presented all this, and this one actually starts from phase 2, so what can you recommend to AdAlta that's just starting phase 1, and we're all anxious for AdAlta to start their phase 1.
Yeah.
So what would be your recommendations in terms of how they should conduct it?
No, in terms of phase 1, I think there's pretty standardized pathways in terms of phase 1. moving from initial healthy volunteers to establish the exposure, the half-life, and then almost slightly staggered, but almost in parallel, then move into IPF patients to establish the pharmacology, to confirm that the drug binds to the target, to confirm that the half-life and duration of effect is the same as in healthy volunteers, or at least to quantify the difference, and then move into probably a small phase 1b study, which will probably still be bigger than the Galapagos study potentially, for slightly longer term dosing. There's a lot of, that 23 patient thing, I would have almost called that phase 1b, but the FDA have allowed it, so we've got to keep it on the radar as a potential opportunity. But I would think as an investor, I wouldn't want to invest in 2 big phase 3 trials with 750 patients per group for 52 weeks on the back of that. You want to fill in a few more of the gaps.
Thank you.
So any more questions for Steve? No? Oh, one up the back, one right up the back of Michael.
Just purely out of interest on the Galapagos drug, I take it you're skeptical of that actual positive improvement in the FVC in a small number of patients, or does a positive actual improvement actually mean something? Like, is it actually impressive?
Yeah, I think if you go back and look at the data in detail, at 4 weeks, there's 155 mil improvement. So it sort of goes up and then comes down in parallel to the placebo group almost, where the placebo group just drifts away. So I have to say, I wonder whether there's some form of anti-inflammatory action here, and or a bronchodilator action or something like that, that you will see a little effect on FVC. So I just think, you'd only need to swap a couple of patients from the active group to the placebo group, any sort of sensitivity analysis, and you couldn't be sure. But the FDA have let them go forward. They've got the money because of their Gilead collaboration. Is that Gilead? They've chosen to take that risk.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Steve.